So I want to bounce this over to Dr. Monti and go a little further when it comes to food and these other levers that we have with inflammaging. And I happen to have your book out here on page 8, where you say, there's another link between food and inflammation, and it's shaking up the world. What do you mean by this?
Right. So the relationship between food and inflammation is a very important one. And I think that we were referring in the book, in that paragraph, to this new superfamily of anti-inflammatory molecules known as specialized pro-resolving mediators, or SPMs. And for people who are having any kind of a difficult time keeping track of some of these terms, the good news is the special PDF for tonight actually talks about these things, talks about some of the foods that are inflammatory and the ones that are anti-inflammatory. We call them givers and takers. And so, you know, the givers, the food that give you a good source of nutrition, but also give you some protection against inflammation, are so important, and those are the plant-based foods. We know that there are a bunch of foods that actually increase inflammation. Since, as Dr. Bazzan was alluding to, inflammation is really the source and the fuel for almost every illness process we think about and worry about, especially as we get into those middle decades of life, from chronic diseases to even the acute response from something that's relatively new. Inflammation on its own is normal. We need the inflammatory response, as Dr. Bazzan was saying, if we have an acute injury or if we have an acute infection. We need to mobilize the immune system to create an inflammatory response. That heating up of the system, so to speak, is for a reason. It's protective, it's adaptive. The problem for many of us is that we have too much of it going on all the time. So there's things that we do that are within our control that can increase inflammation systemically or decrease it. And food, as you were mentioning, Dr. Gottfried, is an important one. And so we know that saturated fats, for example, and omega-6 fats, are pro-inflammatory. And when we say pro-inflammatory, we basically mean sets off the mechanisms in the body to create inflammation. So that's what that particularly type of food does. Whereas the healthy fats that we've mentioned before, the omega-3 fatty acids, for example, those are anti-inflammatory. So their metabolic pathway actually has an anti-inflammatory effect. Other anti-inflammatory foods include those green vegetables that we know are good for us, but certainly there's certain spices and herbs that are particularly anti-inflammatory, such as turmeric and curcumin, which gets a lot of attention, and we've lightly mentioned it before, extracts of green tea, and so on. We tend, when we're talking to people, not to focus on the minutia of different foods, but try to start with general categories of foods that are going to be anti-inflammatory and alert people to the general categories of foods that are pro-inflammatory. The other thing that has a big impact on inflammation is how much excess body fat people have, because the excess fat creates inflammatory chemicals also, and also metabolic disturbances. And so food and excess body fat are both independent sources of inflammation. Another independent source of chronic inflammation that we talked a lot about in the previous modules is stress. So as you think about it, one of the unifying mechanisms for a lot of what we talk about is inflammation. And one way of improving biological age is to decrease it. And all of the things that decrease inflammation are those health promoting, wellness oriented strategies that we're talking about. Now, you're also going to talk, I know, some more with us about hormones. And as we age and circulating sex hormones go down, they actually have an inflammatory protective property to them. So when those go down too low, inflammation also goes up. But I'll wait for that question, but end by saying we really underscore in the book, but also the PDF that we're going to post, some of the food choices that can make a big difference in terms of inflammation. And then related to food is, in addition to body fat, is also the integrity of the gut. And Dr. Bazzan was alluding to this with the gut microbiome, that foods that we eat can have a deleterious effect on the microbiome. Stress can have a deleterious effect on the microbiome in terms of having the right balance of microbes that we've talked about in previous modules. So everything sort of works together in this network fashion.